It's like we're stuck. You know, like a needle on a scratch record.
It's one of those infinite time loop situations you might have heard about.
It's a thing where the same day keeps happening?
I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd.
Time. I promise to explain everything later, but I need you to trust me.
Slow down! What are you, in a damn time loop or something?
Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again. And that must mean that I'm Professor Robert E.G. Black, and this week we have, a special episode. I'm going to call it, I think, What is a Strange Loop? Part 1. Don't expect Part 2 next week. It'll come much later. Maybe there'll be a Part 3. I don't know. Background. We'll get into what I'm talking about in a moment, but background. When I was doing my blog, there were certain sources that recurred a lot. Some of them I barely remember what they were, what the titles were about, but I remember the names. I remember Ryan Gilbey because I mentioned him in this show recently. He was one that I quoted a lot about screenplay structure. But there was Suzanne Doughton, Claire Baca, there was Izod. I don't remember Izod's first name. Different people that came up from, I was going through grad school at the time in communication studies, but also just stuff I would find online depending on the thing. I was basically a lot of the blog entries in that first year, and probably all 4 years of the blog, were essentially research papers. I'm writing commentary on a movie as I watch it, usually, while also researching reviews and behind the scenes and whatever. Philosophical stuff. Oh, a big philosophical thing in Groundhog Day that first year was Nietzsche. Eternal recurrence. I haven't talked about it since coming back to this show yet, but it'll come up. And I'll probably have some good blog entries to read about that regarding eternal recurrence, regarding deja vu.
Most of life is just junk, right? It's filler. And then there's these moments.
It's a perfect day. You couldn't have planned a day like this.
Well, you can. It just takes an awful lot of work.
When all the randomness turns into something perfect. It's like life's dropping all the bullshit just for a second to show us how amazing it could be all the time if it wanted to.
I don't know. I think maybe we're supposed to become like better people. Though I honestly don't even know how that could be possible.
Whoa, now. Sounds like someone's got a case of the time loop blues.
Ever think about it? We must miss so many of them. All those tiny perfect things are just poof, gone. Lost forever. But not today.
You can make right what once went wrong.
That is a disturbingly inspirational idea, Mark.
I know, but what is this? Some kind of time loop, like a gypsy curse? Is the universe giving us a cosmic test, or am I just going fucking crazy?
Time.
The last revision is what counts, apparently.
What if we found them all? All the perfect things in this one town, in this one day. We could collect them.
Time loop of the week, A Strange Loop, a musical, which is a musical by Michael R. Jackson, which I just had the opportunity to see. I had listened to the soundtrack for it a handful of years ago. I don't remember how many. I want to say it was 2018? 2017? When did this musical come out? I don't even remember. It won a Pulitzer Prize. The description from the back of the book, the published version of the script, says, Usher is a black queer writer working a day job he hates while writing his original musical. A piece about a black queer writer working a day job he hates while writing his original musical. This blistering musical follows a young artist at war with a host of demons, not least of which are the punishing thoughts in his own head, in an attempt to understand his own strange loop. I'm going to work backward here. The setting, as listed at the beginning of the book. A loop within a loop within a loop inside a perception of one man's reality. I think this is the first song in the show. Among other lyrics, I want to break the cycle that's so ingrained in me, but change comes way too slow and I am in a hurry. So days like this just get me. I hate days like today. Days when I see myself and see the same reflection. Someone who's stuck rewriting, but stuck in his own way. Someone who plans to edit every imperfection today. Today I plan to change myself. At one point, the character of Usher explains to what turns out to be an imaginary man he meets waiting for, is he on the subway train or waiting for a train? I forget. But he explains what he's writing, which is a musical called A Strange Loop. He says, A Strange Loop, what's the significance of the title? And Usher says, well, don't fall asleep, but it's a cognitive science term that was coined by this guy named Douglas Hofstadter, and it's basically about how your sense of self is just a set of meaningless symbols in your brain pushing up or down through one level of abstraction to another, but always winding up right back where they started. It's the idea that your ability to conceive of yourself as an I is kind of an illusion, but the fact that you can recognize the illusion kind of proves that it exists. I don't totally get it, but it's also the name of this Liz Phair song I really love. So that's his explanation. Immediately the name sounded familiar. I don't think I looked up what A Strange Loop was when I first listened to the soundtrack to the musical. I should have. But when he mentioned it there and mentioned Hofstadter, I'm like, I've heard that name, but I couldn't think of why. I think I have two more things highlighted in the book. One near the end when he's not sure about the end of the show, kind of. He says, and if he does get the change he wants, what is he facing now? Or does he not change and it just starts all over again? Usher explaining the plot. This is in the play. It's about a black gay man writing a musical about a black gay man who's writing a musical about a black gay man who's writing a musical about a black gay man, etc. Loops within loops and all that. I originally caught wind of this show because someone talking about strange loops and repetition and A Strange Loop, the musical, when it was, whatever year it was new. And listened to the soundtrack, kind of enjoyed it. It's a sexually explicit lyrics, talking frankly about gay sex, about oppression, about bigotry, and about artistry, about being a creative person in a world that doesn't necessarily reward you for that all the time. And in his case, the character of Usher is a black gay man living in a world where being a black gay man is a couple strikes against you. The play is funny. The play is fun. The play is sad. It's a comedy, mostly, but it is also horribly sad toward the end. But I wanted to talk about it because what I did after seeing the show is I bought the book of the show. And then I looked up Douglas Hofstadter. And I realized why I had heard of him. There was a book, Gödel, Escher, Bach. Which, the thing about Gödel, Escher, Bach is, this is a book that has been on my radar multiple times. Gödel, Escher, Bach came out in 1979. I'll read to you what it's about. Let me see. It explores common themes in the lives of the works of logician Kurt Gödel, artist M.C. Escher, and composer Johann Sebastian Bach. And by doing so, the book expounds concepts fundamental to mathematics, symmetry, and intelligence. This is where he coins the idea of the strange loop. And then later in 2007, so quite a bit later, he comes back to that topic in a book called I Am a Strange Loop. So what I did is I buy the book of the musical, and then I buy a copy of Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is a book I've had on my wish list before and then removed because I forgot what it was, and then put back and then forgot what it was and removed. So it's a thing that's come up several times. I'm like, finally, I'm going to buy it. It's a big book. It's like a couple inches thick, paperback. I'm going to try to read it or at least skim through it. I feel like I'm going to do something like I did with, I shouldn't admit this, but Paul Hannum's The Magic of Groundhog Day. I'd never read the entire book. I read the first couple chapters word for word. I skimmed through some of the middle, read some stuff at the end. Because I was using it as a source in a blog, I didn't try to read the whole book. I still want to. I should get to it. And I might have time this summer, I hope. I want to read Gödel, Escher, Bach now, and I Am a Strange Loop, both of Hofstadter's books. But I just want to describe to you, like, which one of these do I want to do first? This is straight out of Wikipedia. Well, actually, no. It's a quote from I Am a Strange Loop, but it's on Wikipedia is where I found it, because I have a physical copy I haven't read through yet. I wouldn't know how to find this definition quickly. In I Am a Strange Loop, Hofstadter defines strange loops as follows. And yet when I say strange loop, I have something else in mind. A less concrete, more elusive notion. What I mean by strange loop is, here goes a first stab anyway, not a physical circuit, but an abstract loop in which, in a series of stages that constitute the cycling around, there is a shift from one level of abstraction or structure to another, which feels like an upwards movement in a hierarchy, and yet somehow the successive upward shifts turn out to give rise to a closed cycle. That is, despite one's sense of departing ever further from one's origin, one winds up, to one's shock, exactly where one had started out. In short, a strange loop is a paradoxical, level-crossing feedback loop. And that's complicated. Philosophical writing often is. But it's necessary when talking about Groundhog Day. What is the point of Groundhog Day as a serious thing that's worth looking at in the way I have? I mean, I watched it every day for a year and wrote 1,000, was aiming for 1,000. I believe the average for the first year was 1,400 word blog entries. Because I actually went through and calculated it for those 365 for my master's thesis. I continued watching Groundhog Day at least once a month for 3 more years of that blog. I wrote my master's thesis about blogging and about the presentation of self on the internet and how we invent who we are. Did I use the best terms? Did I get the best research? No, but that isn't necessarily the point either. We do what we do. I teach my students when they're giving a speech, like, you don't have some generic hook about, like, everyone has things that are important to them, and here are 3 things that represent me. It's like, yeah, that gets the job done, but it's not good. Give us a hook that is unique to your speech. Give us a story that is uniquely yours. Give us, when I run D&D, I want my D&D game to be my D&D game. I'm running Curse of Strahd, which was a published adventure. I am barely using the book, because mine immediately expanded into lots of other Ravenloft-related stuff and became this other thing that was uniquely mine. I am creating, and if you listen to The First Syllable, my other current podcast, you would hear a lot about this. I am creating a world, Basara, that I potentially might use for some D&D games. I don't know. But I am definitely writing stories there. I have set stories there, written multiple novels set there. I just wrote a new one in December and January this past year. And hope to write another one soon, this summer. Because I like creating this thing that is uniquely mine. But then I also come back to it. I wrote stories from, the earliest story I remember writing was in the 4th grade. It was, I think I've mentioned it in First Syllable. It was called The Black Lion, and it was only about 3 pages long. I didn't get much done. It starts out, I wouldn't have known this term at the time, but it starts out in media res with, we have this guy who for some reason is able to turn into a black lion. And then his enemy is this guy who can turn into a white tiger. And it was really dumb, but I was in 4th grade. What the fuck? You're dumb. But I remembered recently an earlier story. But I don't know how much of it I wrote. It was maybe a page. I still have the Black Lion thing, which is fun. I don't think I have this other one at all. I do remember it was accompanied by a drawing, which was like a target reticle looking through a telescope on a gun pointed at the top of someone's head. But it was something that happened in playing, I believe, with my cousins. I think it was my cousins. Might have been friends from school. We were playing outside the house where I grew up, and we were playing this game where, in the game, we were playing with fake guns, and then this portal appeared and we went through it, and suddenly our fake guns were real and these people were hunting us. And so this whole game within a game where things became real. And then later that day I wrote down part of the story, like the beginning of it. I don't have that anymore, I don't think. But that would have been earlier than 4th grade. I don't know when. Or maybe around the same time. This doesn't get into the loop, but it does get into, like, I was writing stories in 4th grade. I was writing more stories later. I drew a lot of things. I loved reading role-playing books. Lone Wolf books, if you're familiar with them, by Joe Deaver and Gary Chalk. I love those books. I've told a story in at least 1 or 2 podcasts about having to get rid of those books in, was it the 8th grade? Because I went to a private school where when a certain teacher saw one of those books and looked at it, he basically reported it to the principal's office, and my parents were called, and it was a whole ordeal where they thought I was reading demonic things. And then my parents made me get rid of the books, and you know what I did almost immediately is start buying them again. Because why not? Repetition. But stories, I would keep coming back to them. I first conceived of Guardia, which is the immediate central starting point for stories set in Basara, in the late 90s? Mid-90s? I forget the exact year. I'd have to find the original notes, which I think I still have, on figuring out just some places that are in this fantasy world, because it was going to be an offshoot of my Diamond Bay stories. Now it'll be Diamond Cove, although I'm not going to. Those stories I don't really want to revisit and rewrite. I kind of like the idea of Diamond Cove still existing, and it may still be the locale for a Basara-related story, which would be taking a couple basic beats of the first novel I completed and using it to create a much better, more interesting novel about religion and faith and desperation and the need to find meaning in a world increasingly meaningless and troubled. And it's about, I haven't settled on what church he's in. I'll figure that out later. I think originally it was Protestant, just generic Christian, but it's about a priest in our world who sort of inadvertently discovers that while he's starting to have problems with his faith here, he learns that there might be actual gods elsewhere, and he wants to go to this world where they are. And he ends up becoming a major character in Basara. He's already been mentioned in Four Finger Discount, the book I just wrote last December and January. Did I say wrote? He's a minor character in that. He'll be a minor character in Chase 2 Rabbits, which is the one I want to write next. He'll be a major character in a later thing if I keep writing this stuff, but who knows if I'll keep writing this stuff. I wrote a bunch of novels from 1996 to about 2002. I wrote almost every day. I would occasionally take a day off if I was going to do something like going to Disneyland or something that was going to take a whole day or on a trip. But mostly I was writing, and I wrote, I want to say it's 14 novels. One of them has been self-published as an ebook, and you could probably find it on Amazon as an ebook. It's called Clubhouse Blues. If you're curious, I could send you a link, because sometimes the search doesn't work when I try to find it. But it is there. Clubhouse Blues is set in the town of Reverence, which is near Diamond Cove. But anyway, then I stopped writing. I wrote the occasional thing. I wrote a couple screenplays. I wrote for several years nothing. I got busy doing other stuff. Then I went back to college and went to grad school, and so I wasn't writing a lot of fiction because I was busy writing other things. Essays, papers, things to be published. My master's thesis, which is like 130 pages or something. And then I think D&D brought back some of it, where I wanted to write more Guardia stuff. And about the time that my wife and I separated, a little over a decade ago. Wait, what year is it? It's 2024, so 12 years ago. I was coming up with an idea for a Guardia-related story that I never ended up writing, and I still want to. That story in particular has stuck with me. It's called The Last Song of Whisper Blackbraid, which is about two brothers, one of whom is a local sheriff, having to stop a series of murders by this legendary pirate who when he was going to be captured, sought refuge in a place called Finity Field. The thing about Finity Field is when you come out of it or go into it, you don't know when you're going to go back in or come back out. Like, the time doesn't work right. You could go in and come out years later. You could go in and come out a week before. And so they have to stop a series of murders by this guy, not knowing, even if they stop him, that he doesn't still have murders he's already committed in the future. And they have to come up with a way to figure that out, to know if they have actually stopped him. But then I didn't write it, because then I wasn't feeling very good about life for a little while, and that's when I was in grad school, and that's when I took up my blog and kind of brought my brain back around to a healthier something. And then I wanted to write again. I wanted to create homebrew D&D stuff. Characters I made to play as that have adopted into stories. Characters I created for campaign I ran before that went a few years. Bring those characters back and put them in stories. Because it just repeats. I realized recently that some of my earliest memories, I'm not sure exactly if they're memories or memories of memories, and that's how memory kind of works. Watching Flash Gordon on the big screen in 1980, and I'm 4 years old, do I remember seeing it on the big screen, or do I remember being familiar with it when watching it at home when we had it on video, and seeing it many, many times over the next decade after that? Or did I remember it from that first time in the theater? I remember seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark in the theater. That's in, 81? When I'm 5? I remember my mother trying to cover my eyes when Pat Roach is going to get his face stuck in the propeller blades, because she didn't know they weren't going to show that. She should have, because so far that movie was avoiding gore and things like that. But she missed. And I saw it. And I was like, whatever. Try to cover my eyes, I'm just going to try to see it more. A strange loop. The way I understand it, just like in my blog, I had to write about eternal recurrence in the way I understand it. But a strange loop is about the abstraction of the levels of our sense of self, our identity. No matter how much we change, we'll still circle back to who we are. And we can change some fundamental things about ourselves, but that could be a sort of true Scotsman fallacy, in that if we can change it, maybe it isn't a fundamental thing about ourselves. Maybe what makes something fundamental is we can't change it. I don't know what this description is from. It's in the Wikipedia for strange loop. According to Hofstadter, strange loops take form in human consciousness as the complexity of active symbols in the brain inevitably leads to the same kind of self-reference, which Gödel proved was inherent in any sufficiently complex logical or arithmetical system. Gödel showed that mathematics and logic contain strange loops, propositions that not only refer to mathematical and logical truths, but also to the symbol systems expressing those truths. This leads to the sort of paradoxes seen in statements such as, "This statement is false," wherein the sentence's basis of truth is found in referring to itself and its assertion, causing a logical paradox. Hofstadter argues that the psychological self arises out of a similar kind of paradox. We are not born with an I. The ego emerges only gradually as experience shapes our dense web of active symbols into a tapestry rich and complex enough to begin twisting back upon itself. Which coincidentally is what Inside Out 2 is about, which is out in theaters right now, which I also saw last week. The sense of self that Riley is getting as she goes through puberty, and how that sense of self can be mutated and transformed under the right circumstances. And almost lost. Spoilers. According to this view, the psychological I is a narrative fiction, something created only from intake of symbolic data and its own ability to create stories about itself from that data. The consequence is that a perspective, a mind, is a culmination of a unique pattern of symbolic activity in our nervous systems, which suggests that the pattern of symbolic activity that makes identity, that constitutes subjectivity, can be replicated within the brains of others, and perhaps even in artificial brains. Which circles back for me to Ex Machina and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. It was this whole trilogy that fell apart because I was trying to do too much, but I keep coming back to the things from those stories. Ex Machina was about AI and what makes someone human. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, if you remove key memories, does it change who you are? Does it leave holes that you will notice? Or do those holes repair themselves? Or do you just go back and back and back and get into the same relationship time and time and time again? Even if it's not with the same person. Take it as a metaphor. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is about having a type, and they have a whole discussion about having a type in Ex Machina. So there's all this crossover, and then we get to Groundhog Day, which is all about a guy who definitely has a certain type that we don't even know. But he has a type as far as not of woman, but of like a day, of life, of being the one who makes fun of everyone, the one who does his job and is good at it, sure, but he does it on his terms. He mocks people. He treats everyone as if they're silly and less than he is. And it doesn't come out in the film version as much as the original script and later versions of the script, but he's a womanizer who dates all the interns at the station and probably goes out to bars and picks up women just like he picks up Nancy Taylor. Just not quite in the same methodology. Still the Wikipedia. These are coming from, that last quote from there was from Philosophy Now. Oh, it's the thing I have open. Okay. I'll get to that in a second. An article called I Am a Strange Loop by Douglas Hofstadter. It's a review by Scott O'Reilly on philosophynow.org. This thing I'm about to read is from, it's from the book itself, I guess. Or it's referencing a direct quote. The strangeness of a strange loop comes from our way of perceiving, because we categorize our input in a small number of symbols, by which Hofstadter means groups of neurons standing for one thing in the outside world. Going back to Inside Out 2, or Inside Out, it's those islands. My earliest memories are watching movies, or watching a movie be filmed, in the case of Halloween 2. So what is it that fascinates me time and time again ever since is movies, is stories, is fiction, is this idea that we can create entire worlds. In retrospect, I think that's why I never fully bought into religion, even though I was raised with it. Why I wrote that paper in, 9th grade or 8th grade or whatever that was, about how I only believed in God because I was told to. And my teacher didn't like that argumentation, and I'm like, well, what else am I going to give you? You haven't presented any evidence that I actually buy. I didn't really consider myself an atheist till still a few years later, when someone outright asked me if I believed in God, and my impulse was to say no. And then I realized that that impulse was something I'd felt for a while. But I think, in retrospect, it is perhaps my fascination with fiction that kept me from buying into religion, or not buying into religion helped fuel my fascination with fiction, or both. Probably both. Because if we have these stories that are so big, so powerful that we can tell them and tell them and tell them again and again and again, and people buy into them as if they are real and live their lives, or try to live their lives, or claim to live their lives and fail outright because they're hypocrites. But based on these stories, on whatever God, whatever mythology, whatever modern religion they have or had. And then they try to force that stuff on other people because it just feels like the only way that you can demonstrate that you're right. If I am right about what I believe, then don't I have some sort of obligation to give it to you? Then I'm looking at this Philosophy Now article, which is a review of I Am a Strange Loop, the book. Let's see. Do I want to read this whole thing? It's not that long. I'll read a bit. Maybe skip around. Scott O'Reilly loops the loop with Douglas Hofstadter, it says. This is a quote at the beginning. You would not find the boundaries of the soul, no matter how many paths you traveled. So deep is its measure. Today, more than 2,000 years after Heraclitus wrote those words, science has shrunk the boundaries of the soul considerably. A soul that can transcend space and time, survive death, and even possess others is considered intellectually passé. In its place we have the brain, a teetering bulb of dread and dream, as the poet Russell Edson described the gray matter which makes us who we are, which is the indispensable substrate of our personal identity and consciousness. As the brain goes, so goes the mind, they say. Not so fast, protests Pulitzer Prize-winning cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter in I Am a Strange Loop, the thoughtful companion to Gödel Escher Bach, his seminal contribution to consciousness studies and the field of artificial intelligence. Strange Loop says that each of us is a point of view, and one's perspective, indeed our most intimate subjectivity, can exist in other substrates outside of the brain. No, Hofstadter hasn't gone mystical, religious, or superstitious, but he has pushed the boundaries of science by thinking poetically. This leads him to some very fruitful ways of looking at consciousness. Does the score of a Bach fugue contain a trace of the composer's soul or essence? Certainly there is a world of difference between the old master himself and the folio of his sheet music lying waiting to be played. Nevertheless, that objective musical notation does represent a pattern of symbolic activity that once danced through Bach's brain. And when we listen to a particularly sublime passage, Hofstadter speculates, are we not in some sense sharing in Bach's subjectivity? That is, in his experience. Poetically speaking, Bach, Mozart, Shakespeare, Plato, Socrates, and our loved ones can live on through us insofar as we can see the world through their eyes. Immortality by proxy may not be what most of us have in mind when we think about life after death, but it seems to me Hofstadter is onto something very profound. Hofstadter subscribes to the concept known as the narrative self, the notion that the idea of the self is ultimately a hypothetical construct, a story our brain spins, which generates the illusion that there is a single, stable, and unified locus of willing, thinking, and choosing, which constitutes our I. We are like Scheherazade, the queen narrating the 1001 Arabian Nights, who postponed her execution by seducing the king with one fantastic tale after another. Similarly, our I can only be sustained through an act of perpetual storytelling on our brain's part. Yet who or what is doing this storytelling? According to Hofstadter, the threads that make up the tapestry of a self are patterns of active symbols, neurological patterns, that mirror the outside and also the inside world. For instance, we experience an object, we see a flower for example, which causes a pattern of neuronal firings that symbolize or represent the external object. Our concepts are built up this way. For example, the fast-moving furry critter in our visual field with whiskers and spots triggers a complex pattern of neuronal activity that once stored as a memory symbolizes a leopard. Our enormous craniums each contain 100 million neurons, with each individual neuron making thousands of potential connections, making our brains the most complex information processors in the known universe. Moreover, the concepts we can create are infinitely extensible, meaning we can pile concept upon concept to generate ever-increasing levels of generalization and abstraction. The individual leopard belongs to the genus feline, part of the category mammal, which falls under the heading life form, which is itself subsumed in the more encompassing class of being. Concepts are also extensible in that we can map analogies between seemingly dissimilar concepts. For example, one might say that writing an original philosophical article is a lot like trying to cut a trail through the jungle. They are both arduous processes where the destination is uncertain, but the possible thrill of new vistas and discoveries provides motivation. No two concepts could seem more dissimilar on the surface as writing philosophy and trailing through the jungle. Yet thanks to the infinite extensibility of concepts, we perpetually manage to make useful comparisons between seemingly disparate ideas. Perhaps Hofstadter's most intriguing argument is that the complexity and extensibility of active symbols in the brain inevitably leads to the same kind of self-reference which Gödel proved was inherent in any complex logical or arithmetical system. In a nutshell, Gödel showed that mathematics and logic contain strange loops, propositions that not only refer to mathematical, logical truths, but also to the symbol systems expressing those truths. The recursiveness inevitably leads to the sort of paradoxes seen in statements such as, "This statement is false." Hofstadter argues that the psychological self arises out of a similar kind of paradox. We are not born with an I. The ego emerges only gradually as experience shapes our dense web of active symbols into a tapestry rich and complex enough to begin twisting back upon itself. According to this view, the psychological I is a narrative fiction, a point that Wittgenstein made when he argued that the I is not an object in the world, but a precondition for there being a world in the first place. It is the I that is deeply mysterious, exclaimed Wittgenstein. A perspective, a mind, is therefore a consequence of a unique pattern of symbolic activity in our nervous systems, but Hofstadter contends it's the symbolic pattern that is paramount, not the nature of the physical substrate. That is, if their logical activity was organized in an equivalent way, silicon chips could support consciousness just as neurons do. Hofstadter also believes that the pattern of symbolic activity that makes me who I am, that constitutes my specific subjectivity, can be instantiated within the brains of others. The notion may seem far out at first, but I believe Hofstadter is onto something. As he observes, each of us is a more than just a self. We are a collection of selves. In addition to a core self, which we identify as our I, each of us contain neuronally based symbolic models that mirror and reflect the other people in our lives. These patterns of symbolic activity have a certain degree of autonomy, insofar as they really do simulate the perspective of our significant others. Hofstadter contends that if we have lived and loved someone long and deeply enough, our symbol models will come to mirror their perspective ever more closely. We will essentially be able to see the world through their eyes. Hofstadter acknowledges that the simulated subjectivity of another in us will not be as robust as the subjectivity that arises in the cranium of its owner. However, Hofstadter's intuition seems to me is a remarkably deep way of understanding the permeable fluidity and the profoundly poetic dimensions of selfhood. The Cartesian prison of isolated and monadic selves is demolished in favor of selves that are deeply enriched and entwined by their relationships to other points of view. Hofstadter is a natural phenomenologist and the first-rate scientist, a pretty good combination, by the way. Yet his forays into the philosophical implications of his ideas, though often provocative, are the most frustrating part of his book. For instance, he argues that concepts like free will make no sense in terms of scientific explanations of matter at the most fundamental level. Yet Hofstadter readily acknowledges that when we shift our attention to the macroscopic everyday world, invoking free will or the intention of an agent is frequently the most expeditious and justified way of arriving at an explanation of the behavior in question. Pausing, interrupting, because that's not frustrating at all. That makes perfect sense. Free will is a label we put upon a very complex thing that we can't really fundamentally understand because it has involved so many moving parts. Wait, is that not obvious? Isn't it obvious? Let's throw in some fucking Bullworth right there. What? How is that frustrating? Of course free will is the... Ow! No, that was frustrating part of this thing I'm reading because that wasn't frustrating. Back to it. Back to O'Reilly. Oh, his name's O'Reilly. Just like the old man in Groundhog Day. To understand this, Hofstadter asks us to consider two very different levels at which we might view the Mona Lisa. 1. At the micro level, observed reality will consist of subatomic particles combining together to create pigments which reflect light of a certain wavelength. 2. At the macro or everyday level, however, we experience an entirely different reality, a gal with an enigmatic smile. Which is more real? Fuck you, O'Reilly. They can both be real. There's no contradiction there. Fuck it. Similarly, the utility of thinking in terms of free will depends on which level we're discussing, Hofstadter says. There are several problems here, however. If the self is a narrative fiction, then how does it pull the levers which initiate free action? who cares? I think that's part of my going hand in hand with being an atheist is there are certain things like this where I'm like, the how of it doesn't matter to me. I understand why someone would want to study that. But I'm like, that isn't a philosophical question. The self can be a narrative fiction as a label. I'm putting air quotes on it. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a thing that makes choices. We might not understand every single step of the process that makes it make the choices it makes. But we can understand that it does it. It's like when I want to explain my fundamental understanding of the universe and how it exists. The Big Bang happened. People are like, well, where'd the matter come from? I'm like, it didn't come from anywhere. It just existed. Matter is a thing that exists. You want proof? Just knocked on my fucking desk. Matter exists. Going backward, it can keep existing. Going back to the beginning, it can keep existing and get clumped together, and under great forces of gravity and pressure, it can be so small that it is effectively a dot. And that dot can have so much pressure that coming forward again, it explodes. And at some point, the parts will get so far apart that they will lose their momentum, and then they will start to drift back together. I don't have any problem with this explanation because matter exists. I understand that. I see matter all the time. I feel matter all the time. And that's just the universe. The other thing that people debate is something like evolution. Where I'm like, the only evidence you need that evolution is real, as long as you accept that people have existed for millions of years, which a lot of people that debate evolution don't think that. They think it's about 6,000 years old because the fucking Bible, or whatever religious text they're going by. So it's not as old, and so of course evolution can't work because it works in long scales of time. But all you need for evolution is the fact that you and your parents aren't identical. DNA recombines, it mutates, it changes. And when you mix and match from generation to generation, two people having multiple kids, I'm the 7th child of my parents. They had 6 girls and then me. And the 7 of us are similar in various ways, but all very different as well. Because that's how DNA works. And then we go off and mix with the DNA of other people. 5 of my 6 sisters have kids. Those kids all look different, but you get them together and you can see how people are related to one another. That's all it is. You do that over generations and generations and generations for hundreds of thousands and then millions and billions of years, sorry, I think I'm rounding up a bit. I forget the numbers offhand. But the changes are going to create races and species and all of these breakdown of the animal kingdom and everything that makes all of this what it is. It's complicated, but it's not complex. Or is it the opposite? Fuck. I thought I had a good line there. Is it complex but not? No, it's complex but not complicated. Complex means it has lots of parts. Complicated means it is hard to understand. Yeah, that's what I meant. It's complex, not complicated. Like the self as a narrative fiction. That makes sense to me because in my brain I am talking about who I am all the time. Not with cheesy lines like I am a good person like Riley has in Inside Out 2, but I see what they were going for. And later when her sense of self is more complex, it's more interesting because we're getting more of that. It came across as cheesy when that was the sense of self they kept doing. Because who does that? What kind of person thinks, I am a good person? Weirdo. Where was I? Oh, free action. How does a hypothetical construct exercise causal powers? It does. It just does. Second, when push comes to shove, Hofstadter, dyed-in-the-wool scientist that he is. Fuck you and your dyed-in-the-wool bullshit. Opts for the lawful, deterministic, and in principle entirely predictable universe of matter and physical forces as the most appropriate candidate for ultimate reality. So, when you get down to it, as far as Hofstadter is concerned, the self is the ultimate illusion, or even a hallucination, as he puts it. Okay? I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I don't think it's accurate, but I don't have a problem with it because it's words. When you put words on these things, they're going to get hard to understand. They're going to get hard to explain, and your words for it and my words for it might be different. He says illusion, he says narrative fiction, he says hallucination, he says self. They're all the same thing. If you are listening to this show, I would guess that you are the complicated kind of person who is constantly in your own head, thinking about every choice you make, thinking about the things you want to do. People who listen to Movies by Minutes shows are probably people who are making Movies by Minutes shows, or want to just talk about movies or talk about philosophy. If you're listening to the Groundhog Day Project, it is inevitable that it gets into philosophy, that it gets into belief systems, that it gets into how we think about the whole world and everything about ourselves. So I guess if you're listening to this, you probably understand a lot of what I'm saying, even if you disagree. Because you've thought about this stuff. Maybe in relation to different foci? Right? That's the plural of focuses? Focus? Different centers of focus. How's that? Subjects of focus. Your hallucination, my hallucination. We have things in common. It happens. Anyway, to finish out O'Reilly, we only got one paragraph left. Hofstadter is certainly right in exercising the ghosts of Cartesian dualism. I don't understand that sentence, so I won't comment. The self is not and cannot be some indivisible, indissoluble, and immaterial phantom that nonetheless inhabits the physical body. Why not? I mean, I don't think it is, but why not? I don't think it's immaterial. I don't think there's a soul. Some thing that is inside us, some energy. I don't buy into consciousness as this thing that is bigger than us and like connects us to other people. Yes, can you study the world and large populations as organisms? Yes, because that's how we interact and that's how small things interact. There's micro and macro, the things are similar. But that doesn't mean that there is some actual, literal consciousness that connects us with each other. Or that is even in each of us. It is a word we put on a thing we understand, and we only understand it because it's there. It's like the matter thing. It is. We can feel that it's there. I had a very long argument with someone on Facebook about this once, because he insisted that we couldn't understand that a tree existed without God, and I was like, I can understand a tree exists because I can touch the tree. I can see the tree. I can, if I need to, taste the tree. I can listen to the wind blowing through the branches of the tree. I don't need something bigger than me to understand that the thing I see exists. He got into a whole thing about our senses and why we trust them. And I'm like, I trust them because I've been alive for a while. This argument was about 15 or something years ago, so I was younger, but now, I mean, I've been alive for almost 50 years, so I have 50 years of experience of demonstrating that when I hit this desk or hit something solid, I understand and have an expectation of what the experience is going to be like. And as long as those experiences keep coming back as what I expect, or close to what I expect, because softer surfaces, harder surfaces are different, then I can trust that my senses work because I have been able to trust that my senses work. Because I have been able to trust that my senses work. And maybe that's coming back to the whole strange loop of thing, is that all of this abstraction in layers and layers is how I experience myself as well. I understand that I exist separate from everyone else because yesterday, I existed as something separate from everyone else, and the day before fueled yesterday, and the day before that fueled that day, and the day before that fueled that day. Because I've been doing this for a long time. When you're a toddler, it's more complicated. When you're a child, it's more complicated because maybe you don't entirely understand what you are and why you are and where you are. I think of myself as being actively in my head, as in myself is a thing contained in there. I don't think it's a soul. I don't think it's a literal thing. It is that hallucination. It is that narrative fiction, but it is in there. Just like if I pick up a book, that story is there in that physical book that I am holding. It's also in other copies of that book, but that's a different issue. Or maybe it's the same issue. like the AI side of this, is that this stuff can be reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. And as long as this I that is me can be reproduced from day to day, from day to day, from day to day, then I'm fine. And I know whether or not I can trust my senses until at some point my senses start to not work or not give me honest feedback on the world. If I go blind, if I go deaf, if for some reason I lose my sense of touch, actually there's a spot on one of my fingers that doesn't quite have the feeling right because a few years ago I mangled it in a kitchen drawer incident and then glued the piece back in place because didn't want to go to the hospital over it. Because I believe it was early 2020, so like COVID was, hospitals were full, so I glued it back in place, hope for the best. It healed, it reconnected, blood flows through there, but the nerves don't quite work how they're supposed to. Because it's a fingertip, I can still tell when I'm touching something because that part getting pressure affects the part next to it. But if I just touch that one little spot, I can tell that the feeling isn't right. But that doesn't mean I don't trust the other things because now I'm used to it. The rest of the finger around it works. The rest of the hand works. When I get older, some things might not work as well. And then I have to just change the narrative, change the hallucination, change the illusion. He is also correct in expanding the frontiers of the soul, I believe, and illustrating how the phenomenon of subjectivity is much more open-ended, permeable, and relational than we imagined. When we share our perspective with the receptive other, we are implanting a part of ourself in the other, and vice versa. We can live in others, just as others can live in us. The boundaries of our souls are indeed beyond all measure. Scott O'Reilly, 2010. See, I accept your terms because I understand what you mean by soul. This episode is probably shorter once I edit it, but that I've been talking for almost an hour is insane. I thought this would be a quick little 10-minute jaunt into a philosophy I want to get into later. I think I'm already in it. I do want to read Hofstadter's books. This is why Groundhog Day works for me, I think. I mean, all my favorite stories, or favorite movies especially. Eternal Sunshine is about repetition. It's about how we define ourselves around and through our memory. Ex Machina, about what makes us people. Groundhog Day is about what makes us us when everything else is taken away. I mean, what is Phil Connors going through other than being stuck inside himself? Or, in terms of what O'Reilly is saying here about what Hofstadter is saying here, Phil is becoming part of Punxsutawney. His consciousness, his soul, is connecting with theirs. And the whole point to Groundhog Day is that Phil has to learn to connect with these people on their terms, not his own. He doesn't get rid of his sarcasm, he doesn't get rid of his mocking, but at the beginning of the film, it is mean-spirited. At the end of the film, he's having a good time. No one is hurt by what he's saying in the end, even though he's still making jokes. With maybe a couple exceptions, but I'll talk about those when I get to those scenes. But the basic gist is he has to become part of the community around him. And the community, in turn, accepts him. Is it because he's been going around town saving people and everyone knows about it? No, not necessarily. You can take that final banquet scene as proof, if you like, that Phil Connors is known by Punxsutawney, not because they understand or remember him on a literal level, not because that day they have heard about all the things he's been doing, saving the kid in the tree, trying to save the old man, playing the piano at the banquet, changing a tire, saving Buster from choking, saving that girl from getting hit by a truck. Trying to remember what else was on that last day in different versions of the script. they don't necessarily know about all these things. Just like, unless we read into it, the piano teacher doesn't really think that he's learned his ability from her. I have read into it and decided he could easily have just proven to her he's in a time loop and explained the situation that he's been learning from her for weeks. And then she gets it, and she is excited, and she is proud. And why wouldn't he tell her that? So she could experience something bigger and better. Knowing that this guy up there playing cool music and entertaining this crowd and being fun and being a center of this action on this holiday in this local community that loves this holiday. It would be a better move if he proved to her that he's in a time loop so that she understands that she is the reason he's up there. So I choose to believe that that's what happened. My headcanon. Because what matters is what's in my head. That goes back to Izod and Banesh. We watch a movie. This is the Izod thing by way of Banesh. We watch a movie. The version of that movie that's in our head is different from the version of that movie that is in someone else's head. There are many similarities, but there's also different context for each part. Different understanding for each part. Different belief systems that regulate and control how we think about each part. If we're lucky, we find people in our lives that share similar ways of looking at the world. If we're not as lucky, I at least hope we appreciate the different ways of seeing the world. My strange loop is not your strange loop. And this will come up again. And I'll talk about eternal recurrence sometime soon. When I was writing my blog once, I'll end here. I forget the specific entry. I'd love to find it, but it's hard to find because it was a comment. My sister, Brooke, she's the youngest of my 6 sisters. She said that she thought I had a self-help book in me. I think that's partly true. I don't think I'm good at turning it into a book. Turning it into a self-contained thing that gets out there, goes to a bookstore, and is concrete and simple and finite. But I definitely think that a rant like this, me talking for the past hour, is about me trying to present something about the world that makes, I hope, the corner of the world where you, listener, exist better. Because at some point I won't be here anymore. That idea makes me sad, but it's like the immortality that O'Reilly was just talking about. If I can make some corner or multiple corners of the world better, I have left a mark, I have existed, and if we shadows have offended, think on this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, and whatever the rest of that line is. If you've been listening to this whole episode, I figure you're good people. I thank you. I don't know what I'm talking about next week. I hope your strange loop is going well.
Knew you were gonna say that.
This has been a production of Lemming Drops Studio. You can find links to more at lemmingdrops.com or join the Facebook group Lemming Drops Studio Tour. Also, you can support all my shows at patreon.com/lemmingdrops.
What is wrong in the end which never comes? Or it comes again and again, lapping, like waves.
Since the Big Bang set everything in motion, everything that happens in this universe has to be the way it is. Particles unfolding the way they're destined to.
How do you sleep at night? You've never seen Groundhog Day?
Yeah, you know Groundhog Day is not a documentary.